Assalamu alaikum ji. I'm your instructor and the subject is History and Systems of Psychology, and we are on the American continent talking about behaviorism. We had talked about the early behaviorists, then we had talked about Watsonian behaviorism, and last time we talked about neo or later behaviorists. Today we are going to talk about some more later or neo behaviorists. Again, let me refresh your memory that some of them did not call themselves behaviorists. They have been included in the later or the neo behaviorist categories as a result of the later historians finding similarity between their thoughts, their methodologies, their philosophies and their practices and the practice of behaviorism. तो वो खुद अपने आप को अगर बिहेवियरिस्ट या न्यू बिहेवियरिस्ट नहीं कहते थे तो इसका ये मतलब नहीं है कि जो हिस्टोरियंस हैं उन्होंने भी उनको उस ज़मरे में शामिल नहीं किया. जो बाद में तारीख़ लिखी गई है, एंड रिमेंबर वी आर इन द मिडल ऑफ द 20th सेंचुरी, 1950, 60, 40, 50, 60 की दिहाइयों की बात कर रहे हैं हम. उसके बाद जो हिस्ट्री लिखी गई है हिस्ट्री ऑफ साइकोलॉजी की, उन हिस्टोरियंस ने इन माहिरीन नफ्सियात को नियो या लेटर बिहेवियरिस्ट्स के कैटेगरी में शामिल किया है. इस बात से कंफ्यूज ना होइए. और दूसरे ये कि स्कूल का भी आपको समझ आ गया होगा कि स्कूल मकतबा फ़िक्र वो है जिसमें वो लोग शामिल हैं जिनके ख़यालात, तसव्वुरात और प्रैक्टिसेस जो हैं वो एक सी हों या सिमिलर हों. तो अब हम इससे पहले कि आगे चलें, लेट अस फर्स्ट recapture, review what we had done in the last lecture. If you remember, we talked about three prominent neo-behaviorists whom later historians have put in the category of neo-behaviorists because they practiced the behavioristic philosophy and they practiced the behavioristic methodology. और वो तीन कौन कौन से, मैं नाम उनके अभी नहीं लेता, पहले 2 सेकंड आपको देता हूँ, 3 सेकंड देता हूँ कि आप याद कीजिए तीन नामों को. कौन कौन से हमने पिछले दफे रिव्यू किए थे, जिनके बारे में जाना था. जी हाँ, 1 is Hull, the second is Tolman, and the third was Guthrie. These were the 3 neo-behaviorists that we talked about. अभी इनकी जो prominent एक 2 बातें हैं उनको हम दोबारा रिवाइज करते हैं. पहले सबसे हल के बारे में बात करते हैं, और जैसा कि आप अपनी स्क्रीन पे देखेंगे कि हल ने बिहेवियर की एक नहायत प्रिसाइज एक्सप्लेनेशन दी है. दैट बिहेवियर can be explained according to Hull, he being a mathematician, in a equation, and that equation is, you see it on the screen, SER equals D into V into K into S, H and R, where SER equals, that is behavior, equals D, which is the drive, V, which is the valence, K, which is the incentive, and S, H, R, which is a habit. So what Hull is saying is that behavior can be understood as a result of these 4 factors, or these gestalt or category of factors. And because of his stress on behaviorism, we include Hull as one of the neo-behaviorists. That's one gentleman we talked about. The other gentleman we talked about was Tolman. And Tolman had said two things. One of them, that psychology is a study of behavior, but behavior is purposive. उसका मकसद है. ये दो important बातें ज़हन में रखिए Tolman के बारे में. And then Tolman explains behavior like Hull in a very precise equation. And what is that precise equation? He says behavior can be understood, or behavior is a function of S, A and A. आप अपनी स्क्रीन पे भी देख रहे हैं. Tolman expresses behavior as a result of, as a function of S and A. Function means mazhar, dependent variable, izhar, and S means situational variables, वो चीज़ें जो इर्द गिर्द गिर्दोनवा में मौजूद हैं जिनका एक ऑर्गेनिज्म पे असर पड़ रहा है. And A, antecedent variables, those variables that are within the organism, age, experience, past learning, physiological needs and drives, that are the blood pressure, the chemicals flowing in the body, all of these are, in Tolman's point of view, A or antecedent variables. And Tolman explains behavior in terms of situational and antecedent variables. The third person, the third prominent person that we reviewed, studied in the last lecture was Guthrie. And you remember what he said? He was also influenced by two lines of thought. One line of thought was that of Thorndike. Do you remember Thorndike and his law of effect, of law of exercise and law of recency? He was influenced more by law of recency. Guthrie believed that behavior is predominantly a function of law of recency. He was also impressed, Guthrie was also impressed by writings of Freud, Sigmund Freud, the Austrian psychoanalyst, about whom we will talk in some great detail, who is the inventor of, initiator, originator of psychoanalysis. And he was impressed, Guthrie was impressed with Freud's theory of neurosis, कि इंसान में पागलपन की अलामात कैसे पैदा होती हैं, ये थियरी फ्रॉइड की थी. He was impressed with that theory, and Guthrie formulated his own point of view, and he put across the view that a conflict in our responses results in the neurosis of a person. There are many responses that a person has to choose from, and when there's a conflict in those responses, that creates a neurosis in a person. So from that point of view, Guthrie could be considered a behavior psychotherapist. These were the three prominent neo-behaviorists that we talked about in the last lecture on the American continent. Let me refresh your memory that behaviorism is a basically predominantly American school, American way of thinking, beginning in the early years of the 20th century and stretches practically all over the 20th century. तकरीबन इसका behaviorism का जो दौर है वो तकरीबन 90-100 बरस का बनता है. Alright, let us go forward and look at some other neo-behaviorists or later behaviorists, and one of the important ones, I would even use the term a very important contributor in this regard, is B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner was born in 1904, 1904 में उनकी पैदाइश हुई, and he died in 1990. 86 बरस की उम्र में उनका इंतकाल हुआ. He was at the University of Harvard, and you remember Harvard University is also the place where who worked? Who established the first psychological laboratory on the American continent? William James. And that's where William James worked. What other prominent name do you connect with the Harvard University? That's right, that of Thorndike. तो जाहिर है कि थॉर्नडाइक का इन्फ्लुएंस कुछ ना कुछ तो हुआ होगा. ऐसा ही है. B.F. स्किनर पे हमें दो अहम इन्फ्लुएंसेस दिखाई दे रहे हैं. एक उसके अपनी एज का इन्फ्लुएंस, उसके अपने कंटेम्पररीज का इन्फ्लुएंस. यू रिमेंबर साइकोलॉजी on the American continent in the opening years of the 20th century was defined as the study of behavior. And you remember that there was a great stress on studying what is directly observable using methodologies of physical sciences. That is the atmosphere, that is the ambience. ये माहौल है एकेडमिक सर्कल्स में, रिसर्च सर्कल्स में अमेरिकन कॉन्टिनेंट पे. इससे पहले यूरोप का इन्फ्लुएंस जो आ रहा है, B.F. Skinner was also impressed with the European influence, particularly of his predecessor, Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov had discovered the laws of conditioning, and he had talked about how reinforcement leads to, is a basic ingredient of conditioning. Pavlov had used animals. He was the pioneer in using animals for his research. After that, you remember, of course, Thorndike had also used animals. His law of effect and recency are based upon his experiments with cats, chicks. Remember that? And that is the other influence on B.F. Skinner. He also used animals for his studies, and he formulated his methodologies based upon what is today called the Skinner box. Using a Skinner box, the studies that he carried out and the literature that came out of the laboratories of Harvard University is today called instrumental or operant conditioning. Instrumental or operant conditioning. Later historians now call Pavlov's conditioning as classical conditioning, and the laws and experiments and results that came out of Skinnerian methodologies and Skinnerian research are now called instrumental conditioning or operant conditioning. So we are talking about two types of conditioning here. One emerging out of the European scene, which precedes, which is earlier, which came out of experiments of Pavlov on his dogs from Russia, and that literature, that body of knowledge is called classical conditioning. And then we are talking about another body of knowledge coming out of the laboratories of Harvard University, research carried on by B.F. Skinner, and those pieces of literature, those theories, those explanations of human and animal behavior are called instrumental or operant conditioning. इन बातों में जहां एक सिमिलैरिटी है, वहां फर्क भी है. इसका भी मैं आपको इसका जिक्र कर दूं. लेकिन इससे पहले कि ऑपरेंट कंडीशनिंग और क्लासिकल कंडीशनिंग में मैं फ़र्क करूं, पहले देख लेते हैं कि ऑपरेंट या इंस्ट्रूमेंटल कंडीशनिंग है क्या। जैसे हमने पहले देखा था कि क्लासिकल कंडीशनिंग क्या है, इसी तरह पहले देख लेते हैं कि इंस्ट्रूमेंटल या ऑपरेंट कंडीशनिंग क्या है, और फिर इन दोनों का किसी हद तक जो फ़र्क है वो भी आप पे जाहिर हो जाएगा, या मैं आपसे पूछ लूंगा कि आपको फ़र्क दिखाई दे रहा है। चलिए चलते हैं आगे। As a background to finding out what is instrumental conditioning and how it operates, let me first explain to you how Skinner worked. Skinner devised a box which is now called a Skinner box. और किसने ऐसे एक्सपेरिमेंट्स किए थे? थॉर्नडाइक ने। याद है आपको? which he called a puzzle box. Skinner developed special kinds of boxes. They are now called Skinner box. उसकी सिंपल सी एक्सप्लेनेशन ऐसे दे दूं आपको, that it was a box made of plastic that people could see through, or a box made of mesh or wire net that people could see through. And the box had many variations, but the simplest one was it had a lever at one side of it. That lever could be manipulated, could be played with by the animal in the box. Whenever the animal played or manipulated with that lever and accidentally pressed the lever, some food fell into a plate under that lever which the animal could eat. ये तो बॉक्स की साख्त है, ये उसका स्ट्रक्चर है. A box made of plexiglass या plastic which is see-through, or jali which you can see through, with a lever. The lever could be manipulated, played with by an animal in the box, and whenever the lever was pressed, some food would fall into a plate under that lever and the animal could eat that food. This is the construction of that box, which is called the Skinner box. Now, Skinner conducted experiments primarily with two kinds of animals, white rats and pigeons. चूहों के साथ और कबूतरों के साथ उसने experiments किए, और based upon his experiments, he found out a number of things. First, he distinguishes between positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. He says positive reinforcement is reinforcement which is a kind of reward, which leads to satisfaction. And the other, he calls negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is when punishment is avoided, when pain is avoided. That is negative reinforcement. ये 3-4 बातें आप जहन में रखिए और फिर इससे आगे चलते हैं. स्किनर ने जानवरों को स्किनर बॉक्स में रखा. जानवर की जब भूख बढ़ी तो जाहिर है कि जानवर ने उस स्किनर बॉक्स में भागना दौड़ना शुरू किया और उस लीवर से जो अंदर था उससे खेलना शुरू किया. एंड देन इट प्रेस्ड द लीवर. As a result of pressing of that lever, some food pellets, some food fell into the plate under that lever, and the animal could eat those pellets. Don't confuse plate with pellets. What the animal did was that when it got around the cage, it accidentally pressed the lever. The pressing of the lever resulted in release of pellets of food which fell into the plate under the lever, and the animal could satisfy its hunger. And what do you think the animal would have done after he had been in that cage for a number of hours, for a number of days, for a number of weeks? Obviously, the animal would learn to press the lever, get the food and satisfy its hunger. And that is exactly what happened. And that is how, in simple terms, Skinner discovered learning takes place. Now notice that here the animal has learned to satisfy his hunger by pressing the lever. And that is why it is called instrumental conditioning. An instrument is involved and the behavior of an animal is instrumental, is responsible for creating that bond of conditioning for making the animal learn. अभी इसका जरा कंपैरिजन करें Pavlovian conditioning के साथ. Pavlovian conditioning और classical conditioning में और भी बातों के अलावा the dog did not do anything, it waited. The food was presented or not presented to the dog by the experimenter. In Skinnerian conditioning, the animal itself is responsible for satisfying its hunger by pressing on the lever. So whereas in Pavlovian conditioning, reinforcement is in the hands of the experimenter, in Skinnerian conditioning, the animal itself can reinforce by pressing on the lever. So you see the difference here. The animal is instrumental in seeking reinforcement, whereas in Pavlovian conditioning, the animal was passive. In Skinnerian paradigm, do you understand this word paradigm? Paradigm means experimental design. In Skinnerian experimental design, in Skinnerian paradigm, the animal itself is instrumental, active in seeking reinforcement. Reinforcement is brought on by the animal in the Skinnerian research paradigm, whereas reinforcement is controlled by the experimenter in the Pavlovian experimental paradigm. That is an important, a simple but an important difference between Pavlovian and Skinnerian conditioning, between what we call classical conditioning, that is Pavlovian methodology, and instrumental or operant conditioning or Skinnerian methodology. How reinforcement is manipulated is an important difference between the Pavlovian conditioning paradigm and the Skinnerian conditioning paradigm, between Pavlov's method and Skinner's method. और यही इम्पॉर्टेंट फ़र्क जो है इसको स्किनर ने आगे बढ़ाया है और अभी उसके बारे में भी देखते हैं कि वो क्या है. स्किनर ने कहा that learning takes place as a result of 4 schedules of reinforcement. What are those schedules of reinforcement? I will first name them. Don't be afraid, don't get confused. I'll explain them. What are those schedules of reinforcement? Number 1, fixed ratio schedule, variable ratio schedule, fixed interval schedule, and variable interval schedule. These are the 4 reinforcement schedules by which learning takes place. All right, let us look at these schedules in a little bit of detail. ये आप experimental psychology में और general psychology में detail से पढ़ लेंगे. We will touch upon them in the simple terms, and you would be able to understand what these schedules of reinforcement are in Skinnerian behaviorism. First, the fixed ratio schedule, the first one. A fixed ratio schedule refers to when a fixed number of responses are reinforced. Remember the cage, the Skinner box, and remember the animal could press on the lever in the Skinner box and get food. Should the animal press once to get food, or twice, or 3 times, or 4 times? These number of responses can be fixed by the experimenter. That is one way to teach the animal. The experimenter could teach the animal to press the lever once and get food, be reinforced, or it could condition the animal to press the lever twice, once and then once again, or it could press the lever 3 times, once again, before he gets the food. So the number of responses that are required to gain reinforcement, if they are fixed, that's called a fixed ratio schedule. The second schedule is what Skinner called the variable ratio schedule, when the number of responses are not fixed for reinforcement. मैं अभी इसकी मिसाल रोजमर्रा की जिंदगी में भी दूंगा, इसलिए आप just stay with me for a few more minutes here. Variable ratio schedule refers to when the animal is reinforced not depending upon fixed number of responses but variable number of responses. कभी 2 दफा लीवर को दबा के reinforcement मिल सकती थी एनिमल को, कभी 4 दफा, कभी 5 दफा, कभी 3 दफा, कभी 7 दफा. Now this is an example of variable number of responses leading to reinforcement, and that is the other way in which Skinner saw animals learn. Animals learn by ratio schedules, and ratio schedules are fixed or variable. And then he also talked about the fixed interval schedule, where the animal gets reinforced at a specific time, at a specific interval. Regardless of responses, the animal may get reinforcement, let us say after every 1 minute, or every 5 minutes, or every 10 minutes, or every 20 minutes. When that is the schedule, it is called a fixed interval schedule, when the time period is fixed for reinforcement. This is the third way in which Skinner saw animals learn in a Skinner box. And the fourth way of reinforcing the animal is what he calls the variable interval schedule, where the time interval varies. Sometimes the animal is reinforced at 2 minutes interval, sometimes it is reinforced at 5 minutes interval, sometimes it is reinforced at 17 minutes interval, sometimes animal is reinforced at 3 minutes of time interval. The interval goes on varying, बदलता रहता है interval, और इस तरह से भी animal learn कर लेता है. It can learn that reinforcement is, it can be reinforced at various times, not necessarily at a fixed time. हमारी रोजमर्रा की जिंदगी में बिल्कुल यही शेड्यूल्स हैं. इंडस्ट्री में कुछ इंडस्ट्रीज ऐसी हैं जो that use a fixed ratio schedule. अगर आप इतनी आइसक्रीम बेच लेंगे तो आपको पैसे मिल जाएंगे, अगर आप इससे कम आइसक्रीम बेचेंगे तो आपको पैसे नहीं मिलेंगे. फिक्स्ड है वो रेशो. कुछ इंडस्ट्रीज ऐसी हैं जहां पे रेशो वेरिएबल है कि 4 जूतों के पेयर बेचने पे आपको इतनी कमीशन मिलेगी, 7 पेयर बेचने पे इतनी कमीशन मिलेगी, 9 पेयर बेचने पे इतनी कमीशन मिलेगी। आपका रेशो जो है वो वेरिएबल है, आपका नहीं, किसी शख्स का, सेल्स पर्सन का। और हमारी इंडस्ट्री में ऐसा भी है कि रिवॉर्ड टाइम्स पे कुछ ऐसी इंडस्ट्रीज हैं जहां पर तनख्वाह एक शख्स को फिक्स्ड वक्त पे मिल जाती है। हर माह के पहले हफ्ते के दौरान मिसाल के तौर पर उसको तनख्वाह मिल जाती है, विच इज एन एग्जाम्पल ऑफ फिक्स्ड इंटरवल शेड्यूल। एंड देन देयर इज द वेरिएबल इंटरवल शेड्यूल ऑल्सो। जब माल बिकेगा, पैसे मिलेंगे, तो आपकी तनख्वाह या उस शख्स की जिसने काम किया है माल बनाने में, उस वक्त उसको भी उसका मुआवजा मिलेगा। तो पता नहीं कि मुआवजा कब मिलेगा, कभी 2 हफ्ते के बाद मिलेगा, कभी 4 हफ्ते के बाद, कभी 1 हफ्ते के बाद, कभी काम खत्म होते ही। तो हमारी रोजमर्रा की जिंदगी में हमारे रीइंफोर्समेंट शेड्यूल्स भी वही हैं जो स्किनर बॉक्स के जरिए स्किनर ने अपने एनिमल्स में देखे और देखा कि इनके जरिए से एनिमल्स जो हैं वो लर्न करता है। और यही स्किनर की एक बहुत बड़ी कंट्रीब्यूशन है, हिज डिस्कवरी ऑफ शेड्यूल्स ऑफ रीइंफोर्समेंट। यूजिंग these schedules of reinforcement in one of the very important books that Skinner wrote called Beyond Freedom and Dignity, Skinner had proposed that we can change the entire society by manipulating these schedules of reinforcement, that we can mold, modify, change, radically change the human behavior and the shape of society by using these 4 schedules of reinforcement. How far do you agree with him? Give it a thought. And that is one of the most important contributions of B.F. Skinner. Let us take a look at another later or neo-behaviorist. Later would be a better term, and that is Carl Lashley. As you can see on your TV screen, Carl Lashley was born in 1890 and he died in 1958. He was a pupil of J.B. Watson, and he put forward the view that psychology should concern itself with behavior and behavior alone, and he proposed that behavior is the result of the activity of the cerebral cortex. Cerebral cortex, as you can see on your screen, is a part of the brain that resides within the brain. And Lashley proposed that behavior is the activity of that part of the brain. इससे आगे भी लैशले ने 1-2 बातें की हैं जो मैं समझता हूं इसकी थियोरी में बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट बातें हैं. He has explained what is the function and structure and role of cerebral cortex. हमारे दिमाग का brain, we are not talking about mind, we are talking about brain. हमारे दिमाग का जो हिस्सा cerebral cortex है वो ही हमारा बिहेवियर है, उसी की वजह से हमारा बिहेवियर बनता है. उसमें जो एक्टिविटी हो रही है वो एक्टिविटी हमें बिहेवियर में नजर आ रही है अकॉर्डिंग टू लैशले. लैशले proposed 2 principles related to the activity of cerebral cortex. The first principle that he proposed was the principle of equipotentiality. इसका क्या मतलब है? Principle of equipotentiality means that the entire cerebral cortex behaves in the same way, that a small part and another small part of the cerebral cortex act in the same manner, that there is no difference in the activity of one part of cerebral cortex and another part of cerebral cortex. And the other thing that Lashley talked about in context of cerebral cortex was what is called the principle of mass action, that the entire cortex is involved in activity. The activity of the cerebral cortex takes place in en masse as a whole. ऐसा नहीं है कि कॉर्टेक्स का कुछ हिस्सा एक्टिव है और कुछ हिस्सा एक्टिव नहीं है, कुछ हिस्सा एक तरह से एक्टिवेटेड है और कुछ हिस्सा किसी और तरह से एक्टिवेटेड है, ऐसा नहीं है. ये दो अहम उसके प्रिंसिपल्स हैं और लैशले ने यह भी दिखाया, by his experiments on animals he severed, उसने सेरिब्रल कॉर्टेक्स का कुछ हिस्सा एनिमल्स में काट दिया और फिर उसने देखा कि क्या ऐसा करने से जानवरों के सीखने पर कोई असर पड़ता है. क्या ख्याल है आपका? If a certain part of the brain of an animal is removed surgically, will the animal learn? Will the animal be as efficient in learning, as good in learning as before, or as compared to an animal where the entire cortex is present? Lashley saw that there was no difference. When he removed a certain part of the brain of the animal surgically, the animal's learning did not deteriorate. That is an important contribution that Lashley had made to the understanding of behavior, particularly behavior of learning in animals. Lashley की ये बहुत important contribution थी, that he showed that a part of the brain, that is the cortex, is an important determiner of a organism's behavior. इससे थोड़ा सा आगे चलते हैं. I want to bring in a new thing here. Let me digress a little. Let us take us out of animal theories of Skinner and Lashley and let us go to a human laboratory remaining on the North American continent. In 1924, थोड़ी सी कहानी सुनाता हूँ आपको. That will serve as a background to what we are going to do next. In 1924, some people in the industry wanted to see what are those factors that would affect the productivity of the workers. आपके ख्याल में वो कौन कौन से असरात हैं जिनकी बिना पे एक शख्स की सनत में उसकी प्रोडक्टिविटी बढ़ जाएगी? अगर वो अब 5 कमीजें सी रहा है एक दिन में, तो हम क्या चीज़ उसमें इंट्रोड्यूस करें कि वो 7 कमीजें सीने लगे या 10 कमीजें सीने लगे? अगर वो 5 जूते पैक करता है, अगर वो 3 आइसक्रीम के डब्बे जो है उनको पैक करके गाड़ी में भेजता है, तो हम क्या करें कि उसके जूते पैक करने की तादाद या आइसक्रीम के डब्बे पैक करने की तादाद पहले से बढ़ जाए? ये देखना चाहते थे कुछ इंडस्ट्रियलिस्ट. और उन्होंने, आप भी कहेंगे तनख्वाह बढ़ा दें ऐसा ही होगा, उन्होंने भी ऐसा किया, ऐसा हुआ। तनख्वाह बढ़ाने से लोगों की मोटिवेशन बढ़ी, उनकी प्रोडक्टिविटी बढ़ी। उन्होंने कहा उनका जो माहौल है उसको बेहतर कर दें, बिजली बेहतर कर दें, बिजली बेहतर की, उनकी प्रोडक्टिविटी बढ़ी। उन्होंने कहा, माहिरीन नफ्सियात ने कहा कि इनका टेम्परेचर कंट्रोल कर दें, टेम्परेचर कंट्रोल किया गया, प्रोडक्टिविटी बढ़ी, ऐसा ही हुआ। लेकिन up to a certain point the productivity increased but remained constant. And when the psychologists introduced certain other psychological factors, they saw that even when the pay, the light, the music in the room, the air conditioning in the room remained the same, the productivity still increased. And what were those factors? Those factors were the influence of the co-workers. Who were the people that industrial workers were working along? If the industrial workers liked their co-workers, their productivity increased regardless of all other factors. If they did not like their co-workers, people that they were working with, their productivity did not increase regardless of other factors. So what are we talking about here? We are talking about psychological factors, the worker's likability for his co-worker as a factor that influences his or her productivity in an industry. These were a series of experiments conducted, and they are now called the Hawthorne studies. The Hawthorne studies showed exposed a number of factors, including the factor of the influence of co-workers and the influence of supervision, including likability of a person for his co-workers and including his dislike for the co-workers. His likability for the co-workers positively influenced his productivity, and his dislikeness for the co-workers negatively influenced his productivity or her productivity. What are we talking about here? We are talking about psychological factors. You cannot see likeness. What are we talking here? We are talking about the dislike or the like influencing the productivity of the worker in the industry. Keep that in the mind, and we will go forward of this. We will talk about Hawthorne studies in some detail when we come to organizational psychology, but for the time being, just keep it in mind, and let's go forward with other neo or later behaviorists. अगर आप Hawthorne studies को ज़हन में रखेंगे तो आपको ये इनकी contribution आसानी से समझ में आएगी. One important neo or later behaviorist is Hebb. Donald Hebb was a Canadian psychologist who showed by his observation and experimentation, who supported Lashley's point of view by his experimentation and observation, that when the brain of a person is removed, we are not talking about animals here, we are talking about human beings. When the brain of a person is removed due to some accident, even then that person's IQ is not affected. Remember Lashley's law of equipotentiality? Here is Hebb finding an evidence for what Lashley had said. Lashley had said that the cortex, even when a part of it is removed, since it has equipotentiality and since it operates in mass, therefore, even when part of it is removed, the behavior of a person is not affected. The behavior of an organism, an animal, is not affected. And that is what Hebb had shown in his observation of people that he collected his data from, people who had had accidents and whose brain had become damaged. Even then, their IQ had not decreased, had not suffered. The other person that we need to talk about in this context is Harvey Harlow. He was an American at the University of Wisconsin, and he discovered with his experiments that curiosity, that exploration, and that manipulation of animals influences their learning, such that those animals who are more curious than other animals learn in a different manner than those animals who are less curious. Those animals that have a higher potential for exploration learn differently from those animals that have a lower exploratory drive. Notice that curiosity and exploration are variables that impact learning, and that is what Harvey had shown. The third person in that regard that we need to talk about is Hobart Maurer at the University of Illinois, again an American, who showed by his experiments that hope and disappointment affect, influence learning. Where are we now? We are on curiosity, exploration, hope, and disappointment, all psychological factors influencing learning and behavior. That is what psychologists from their laboratories on human beings and on animals had shown. Do you see the connection between these and the Hawthorne studies? The Hawthorne studies had also shown that psychological factors, the likeness of a person for his co-worker, the kind of supervision that is given to the workers, influence their productivity. And here are psychologists who have shown the same thing, that psychological factors, hope, curiosity, disappointment, influence learning. Behaviorism is now beginning to take in some mentalistic or some non-behaviorist variables into view also. And that is the shift that has taken place from pure behaviorism, where Watson had said that we should only observe and be concerned with what is directly observable. We have also seen that hope, disappointment, curiosity, exploration, likeness, dislike for co-workers, all of these factors impact behavior. So behavior has seen to be influenced by the observable factors, by reinforcements, and behavior is also observed to be affected by psychological factors, hope, disappointment, curiosity, and all of these put together. And that is one of the most important and illuminating contribution of the neo or the later behaviorists, that they have been able to connect behavior with psychological variables also. Before we end today, let us recap what we had talked about. We talked about 4 psychologists: B.F. Skinner, in terms of his schedules of reinforcement. Lashley, we talked about Lashley in terms of his contribution of the role of cerebral cortex. We talked about Hebb, Harlow, and Maurer's contribution in relation to psychological factors related to learning and behavior. That is some of the important contributions of the later or the newer behaviorists. Revise it, take a look at what we have talked about, and inshallah, we'll see you next time. Until that time, look after yourselves. Khuda Hafiz, God be with you.